Did your brew turn out a little too hydrating? We're going to help you fix that. We're going to show you how to increase the alcohol by volume in your beer, mead, cider, and wine with different fermentable sugars. And we'll talk through what flavors they're going to add and how to balance against that. So often we get the question of how do I increase the ABV, alcohol by volume, of my homebrew? Is it as simple as just adding some more fermentable sugars for the yeast? Well, kind of. Kind of it is. But for each different style of brew, whether it's beer, mead, cider, or wine, you really want to lean into a specific fermentable sugar if you're looking for a specific contribution to your flavor profile. Because these sugars are not just going to add alcohol, they are going to add flavor. So we're going to take a look at the four most common homebrews: beer, mead, cider, and wine, and what sugars you might want to add to not only increase the alcohol by volume, but also achieve that flavor profile you're looking for. There are three different kind of schools of thought around how to increase the ABV in a beer. And at the leading edge of technology are brewers' crystals. Brewers' crystals are non-fermentable dextrins with a very minimal, almost zero flavor impact. So they can add ABV while maintaining that thickness, that chewiness that you want in a beer without adding additional malt flavors that you might not want in that beer. And of course, we have Brewers Crystals available at CraftaBrew.com. Other brewers like to use dry malt extract, just a dry malt extract that's going to match the style. For example, making a wheat beer, you might just add a little wheat-based dry malt extract to boost the ABV and body of your beer. It is going to add more wheat flavor though, so you want to make sure that you're working with that rather than against it. Dry malt extract tends to add a nice clean malty character to a beer while increasing the alcohol by volume, and it doesn't tend to mess with the body of the beer too awful much. Now, other brewers might just add table sugar or honey to their beer to up the ABV. The disadvantage here is it does what's called drying out of your beer. Honey, for example, is made from simple sugars, glucose and fructose, which are 100% fermentable. So if the honey ferments all the way out, you're getting ethanol, but you're not really getting anything left over that contributes to body, which can make the beer seem a lot thinner. Table sugar is sucrose. The yeast breaks sucrose down from a complex sugar into two simple sugars, glucose and fructose. And so the exact same thing happens when you use table sugar. So if you are using table sugar or honey to bulk up the ABV of your beer, you might need to add maltodextrin or something similar to enhance the viscosity of the beer so you're not drying it out and leaving it feeling kind of thin and watery. Honey is a great choice if you're making a style called a braggot, which is a beer that carries over flavors of honey. But generally, dry malt extract is going to be the go-to for ramping up ABV in an inexpensive way. But again, if you are on the leading edge of beer brewing, then Brewer's Crystals might be up your alley. Your main goal is to be aware of the bitterness and the body of your beer. An increased ABV can throw off the balance between the alcohol and the IBUs, which is your bitterness from your hops. And so you want to make sure those things kind of stay in balance so you're not leaning too far into one territory or the other. You might need to up your hops slightly during the bittering part of your boil or steep some specialty grains to add some of that beery character back. It's all about balance, and when you're working on a higher than normal ABV for your beer, you are going to have to iterate on that recipe probably a few times before you really dial in that process. For mead, the answer is simple. You add more honey. A lot of folks will do kind of fun things like adding maple syrup or brown sugar or blackstrap molasses. But honey really is generally the go-to and the kind of easiest way to ramp up your ABV. But just like with beer, more honey can tend to dry out your mead because you're adding more ethanol. And so you are going to have to balance against that thinner kind of mouthfeel and flavor profile that you're going to get from a higher ABV mead. A lot of folks won't start with all that honey up front either. Say someone's making a traditional and they want it to be around 18% ABV. They may start with a must that's measured by the hydrometer at somewhere around a potential of 12% ABV. And then once that starts to creep pretty close to dry on the hydrometer, start step feeding the rest of the honey. So that way the yeast are kind of fermenting through it low and slow. That way you're kind of avoiding some of the heat spikes and yeast stress that would come if you added that honey in all on the front end. One of the advantages of adding extra honey to increase the ABV is you get a more bolstered floral profile, which leads to a more honey forward flavor in the mead. However, you will need to balance that against any other ingredients that you might have put in there, whether they're flowers or fruit or spices or fruit zest. And you're going to want to make sure you're using a yeast that can cut through all of those sugars. So, really take a look at your yeast packet or the manufacturer's instructions to understand where the general ABV range of that yeast is. Something like EC1118 or K1V1116 are good high alcohol yeasts that can ferment a pretty clean profile in a mead. And so, if you're trying to take it to 16, 17, 18% ABV, those would be the yeasts we would recommend. Now, with a higher alcohol by volume, you are going to get more alcohol flavors in your mead. It is unavoidable. Generally, long age will help mellow those, but things like heavy-handed back sweetening or adding glycerin to balance in secondary, or even adding oak or vanilla can help balance out some of those higher alcohol notes that kind of poke through on the palate of a really high ABV mead. Whether you're using added honey or you're playing around with more non-traditional fermentables like maple or blackstrap, you can get a really fun flavor profile out of a high ABV mead if you're willing to work on balancing the final product before it goes in the bottle. You always want your mead to taste as perfect as possible before you seal it up in that bottle, because after that, you can't make any more changes. And of course, if you need honey, we have that at craftabrew.com. So, cider. One of the easiest things to make, but one of the more difficult things to make well. And generally, when you're adding extra ABV to a cider, one of the hacks that you see everywhere on the internet is frozen apple juice concentrate. That's right, the same stuff that grandma used to make in the summertime by pouring one can in with, I think it's 3 cans of water. Stir, 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 and you've got apple juice. Well, this can be used to increase the ABV of a cider because it is mostly sugar. Sugar, it's malic acid, and a little bit of apple particulate. And this can really enhance the flavor of a cider while ratcheting up the alcohol by volume. Now, like I said, it is going to increase the acidity of your cider, so you may need to balance against that additional acid, whether that's through added tannin or a nice heavy-handed back sweetening to round out the flavor at bottling. But there are other options as well. You can just increase the ABV by adding sucrose. Just like we talked about doing with beer, it will dry out and thin out the cider, but it is a nice clean way of upping the ABV. But if you're interested in a less clean way of upping the ABV, consider sugars like demerara sugar or regular old brown sugar or even molasses to up your ABV. You're going to get some dark toasty notes, molasses undertone, sometimes even some spice notes can come out of it. It adds darkness and depth and richness to a cider, especially if you're working with juice or apples that are just a little bit too tart. Adding something with a dark, kind of deep profile that kind of pulls that flavor profile of the cider down can balance against those acids. And of course, everyone loves a nice, crisp, refreshing Cider. A Cider is a mead made with apple juice or a cider made with honey. And we have honey available at CraftaBrew, several different kinds that work really well in cider. And honey can dry out your cider, but it does add a nice floral flavor backbone as well. One of the easiest ways to balance against a thin and watery cider is to add maltodextrin or vegetable glycerin in very small amounts, and that just adds a little bit more viscosity to heft up the flavor profile. A similar thing can be achieved by just upping the amount of tannin you have in your recipe. It gives the finish a longer lasting, kind of lingering finish on the exhale, so it doesn't drink so watery and wash away as soon as you swallow. But from my experience around the internet and judging competitions, apple juice concentrate seems to be the go-to hack for upping the ABV of a cider while not obliterating the apple flavor. In fact, you're enhancing it. Too much alcohol in a cider can lead to that drying or thinning or hot effect that you get from higher alcohol. It is something that you will have to balance against when making a higher ABV cider. In Germany, there's a very common style of high ABV apple wine called Apfelwein, and generally it is balanced with additional sweetness in order to offset that alcohol burn. One cheat that a lot of folks like to use to hide that alcohol burn is to add warm spices in secondary, like cinnamon and nutmeg and clove. Those spices kind of enhance but disguise that alcohol flavor, and so you're noticing the spice more than you are the burn from the booze. And finally, wine. And here we're really talking about country fruit wines. Those are the most popular wines made on the homebrewing level, but we're going to touch on grape wines also. For both country fruit wines and grape wines, you can get a hold of grape juice concentrate. Generally, you're going to find white grape concentrate or Concord/red grape concentrate, and that's in your grocer's freezer section, just like the apple juice concentrate. Depending on what grapes you're working with and how much color you want in that final product, you're going to want to make your selection white versus red grape juice, and you want to make sure it is a concentrate that is going to pair well with whatever grape or fruit you're using. These concentrates do add extra acid, so just like we talked about with cider, you're going to want to balance against that acid so you don't have something that drinks too tart. And just like with beer or cider, it's very common to just add extra table sugar to your country fruit wine. It gives a clean flavor profile while enhancing the ABV, and it will ferment all the way out, leaving nothing else behind. Some folks will turn a grape wine into a piment by adding honey to increase the ABV, or turn a country fruit wine into a melomel by adding honey to increase the ABV. Having a significant concentration of honey in your fermentable sugars does transform your wine into what most folks would categorize as a mead, but it can be a nice way to add additional flavors, complementary flavors, florals and bitters that you're not going to get just from the fruit alone. When you're using honey, again, it is going to ferment all the way out. You are going to have residual flavor contributions, but it's going to give you basically pure alcohol, which is going to thin out and dry out your wine. So make sure you are cognizant of balancing against that, just like with all the other brews we've discussed. Added sugars are going to change the balance of basically any brew you're making. And generally that effect is going to be to either thin out your brew or add more acidity to your brew. And those are things that you can balance using bench trials or simple tasting trials to kind of taste through what you like and don't like about your brew and tinker with the balance, whether it's adding more acid or adding more sugar for back sweetening or adding in more tannin to try and offset the high flavor impacts of booze or sweetness or acidity. We've got a couple videos out about how to make and balance mead and cider. Check those out. There'll be links at the end of this video and links in the description so that you can explore those realms a little bit more. Adding sugars to increase the alcohol by volume of your brew is a very common thing folks do, but it does affect your ability to balance, and so you have to be aware of that going into it. We hope that this video is helpful, and we hope that you have recommendations for how to balance against added ABV or maybe non-traditional sugar sources that you use in your brews. Drop a comment down below and let us know, how do you make high ABV homebrew? And of course, make sure you hit that subscribe button, ring that notification bell. You don't want to miss any of the upcoming content here at CraftaBrew. We have a lot of fun videos planned. I'm BC here for CraftaBrew, and until next time, I hope you've got good things brewing.